Introducer. We're very pleased to have Kristine Maurer with us here this evening. She is the Senior Conservation and Natural Resource Ecologist with Hennepin County, here to discuss the Habitat Conservation Program. So welcome, Kristine.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for allowing me to take some time to talk to you all about the program we have to offer in Hennepin County and how that might connect to the work that the Watershed District is doing. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, make sure it was working just a few minutes ago, so hopefully nothing has changed. Does that all look good to everybody? You can see my
That's
screen?
great, thank you.
Perfect. Okay, all right, so I'll go ahead and get going. All right, so I'm going to spend the few minutes that I have with you all today kind of level setting on some of the programming that we have to offer, and hopefully starting to connect some dots with the work that the Watershed is doing, and hopefully that this will lead to future opportunities for the county and the Watershed District to work together, connect, and hopefully be presenters at future meetings and some of the other more specific parts of our programming. So today I'm going to do kind of a high-level overview of our habitat conservation programming, which includes easements, habitat improvement projects, and biological monitoring. I'm also going to do a very quick teaser just based on how I anticipate the timing running here of our Hennepin County Natural Resource Viewer, which some of you may be familiar with, but has had some pretty significant updates over the last year. And I wanted to at least allow some time to show that to you. And then finally, just for some questions. All right, so we're going to start with conservation easements. I wanted to just really zoom out and talk a little bit about what conservation easements are in the first place, since they're not something that's familiar to everyone. They're a voluntary and legally binding agreement between a landowner and an easement entity, like the county can be that entity, a watershed district can be that entity. We do a lot of our easements with our partner, the Minnesota Land Trust, so those can be government entities or nonprofits that can hold those easements. These easements set up restrictions that are voluntary that the landowner agrees upon to protect the land from development, maintain open space, habitat, and rural character. Easements can be for limited terms, so the federal government offers a handful of different easements that have a limited duration. Most of the conservation easements that the state and also Hennepin County manage or establish are perpetual, so they're there forever. That means that they are attached to the deed of a property. So if it's subdivided or sold or inherited in the future, the easement and its terms are there for forever. So hopefully long into the future, long after we're all gone, these places will still be helping to perpetuate open space and habitat for future generations of people and wildlife. The terms can be both flexible and compatible. This is a mainstay of conservation easements and one of the reasons they're a really good tool. So we try to work with landowners to make sure that we're finding that sweet spot of making sure we're meeting our goals, our granting goals, but also making sure that they can utilize that property the way that they want to, and that it's going to be set up in a way that makes it sellable in the future. Landowners also retain ownership and rights to the land, so they can sell it, they can transfer it, they can lease it. All those things are theirs to do. Public access and hunting is not always required. In particular with our easements that we do with the Minnesota Land Trust, these things are not required. Some easements that are through the state of Minnesota do require access to for the public, but this is not something that our programming requires. One of the reasons that we like to use conservation easements, especially in a place like Hennepin County that's very quickly developing, where most of the land is held in private ownership, is that it's a really effective tool for targeting the protection of natural spaces, in addition to those already larger big bodies protected by our park districts and the state, in order to kind of connect and create corridors between spaces that are already protected. And since there is so much private land in a lot of the metro area and elsewhere in the state, private conservation easements are a really important tool to continue to build that network for habitat and open space across the metro, our county, and the state. As I mentioned before, these easements are really valuable because they are flexible, so we can work with landowners in a lot of different ways to meet their needs. It also provides improved access to technical and financial support. So the landowners that do these easements have a lot more access to me and my colleagues to help them with the work that they want to do to improve that habitat. It also comes with oftentimes financial resources to do those projects. And this also applies to partners as well that have protected conservation areas. And I'll talk about that a little more in a few slides. Landowners are also still required to pay property taxes. So I think this is important as we think about, our cities and municipalities and what they also need, that just because there's a conservation easement there doesn't mean that they don't have to contribute to the tax base. And also there are financial incentives for landowners that go beyond just the technical and financial support that we can provide. When we establish a conservation easement, we oftentimes are able to pay landowners for the restrictions that they've placed upon their land. So by giving up some of the rights that they have to development, we can assess the property through a formal appraisal process to understand what we can pay them to counterbalance basically what they've given up. This is a one-time payment. At least in our program. Some programs run by the state run on more of a rental process rate where they can just get money each year, a little bit. It's usually not very much. We're typically able to offer landowners a little more in this upfront process. They're also oftentimes eligible for federal tax incentives. So this can be related to heirs taxes. This can also be related to federal tax deductions associated with donations. So if we were to offer somebody a payment of, let's just say $100, which is drastically tiny, nothing we would ever do. But if we were just to say we would offer someone $100 for their easement, and they decide that, gosh, I don't need that $100 because I have plenty of money and I really just want this money to go farther for other conservation projects, I'm only going to take $10. The $90 that is donated to our program, because the Minnesota Land Trust is a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, can be eligible for federal tax deduction. So there are other financial incentives out there. Those are things that we instruct landowners to work through their own tax consultants and attorneys with to determine if they're the right path, but sometimes they are available. The programming that we have in Hennepin County includes 60 plus conservation easements already. 11 of these are held by the county and the Minnesota Land Trust, and we'll be adding another one in just a few weeks. We have 4 that are kind of remnant from the old Hennepin Conservation District days, 2 that we were acquired through tax forfeit, 10 that we manage for the state from the Reinvest in Minnesota program. So these aren't easements that the county holds, but we're in charge of monitoring and managing and implementing habitat improvement projects and strategies. 2 of those have since ceased. They were established back when the state was still doing temporary easements, but the other 10 are permanent. We also have similarly 17 permanent wetland preserves. So those are also held by the state of Minnesota, in which we manage, and 7 flowage easements and 1 Metro Green Basin easement. So far, we don't have any projects in your watershed. I was kind of sad to see this when I pulled up my map, looked at the project work we've been doing. We have done a few projects down here along the river for habitat improvement work with other partners and cities. But unfortunately, none of those quite cross the threshold of your boundaries. So I'd like to think that this is just a so far and not yet, and hopefully we can find a good place to work with you guys within your watershed district. I did a little bit of snooping around, and there seems to be quite a lot of large park preserves and other spaces in your watershed district that would be great projects for habitat improvement programming, and would really like to talk to you all about that. All right, so we also provide a handful of services to our easements. Those include conducting annual inspections, both on behalf of our county held and MLT held easements, but also for, like I mentioned, the state of Minnesota easements that we help to manage. We also have a biological monitoring program, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute, which looks at all sorts of taxa groups across all these protected spaces we're working on. We do habitat management planning, so we sometimes help cities or friends groups or other things like that who have protected spaces develop plans so that they can successfully implement habitat improvement activities. This is something we really like to see because that helps us to understand that our partner has a strategy laid out and some commitment behind it, so that if we were to invest time and resources into that project, it's more likely to succeed. We also do habitat improvement projects, like I mentioned before. For some of our easements, we assist property owners with dump cleanup. Our grant does not allow us to place easements over dumps. And so a lot of the places in Hennepin County are, agricultural in nature, and we have farm middens and other things like that where people have left, pieces of car chassis and other things that need to be removed. So we'll oftentimes go on and help landowners to mitigate those before closing an easement. In addition to that, we do a lot of coordination with our partners, not just for kind of monitoring and managing our easements, but also keeping track of their status. So making sure that we're up to date on who owns things. A lot of land transfer happens in Hennepin as a quickly developing place. We spend a lot of time just connecting with landowners and also their neighbors to make sure that they're aware of the projects and things that are going on. And we do quite a few outreach and education events. One of the most successful things that we've found is to connect with a landowner and then to use them basically as a connection to the rest of their community and to host an event with and at their property. This has resulted in 3 different large clusters of easements, many of which have resulted in closing across the county, and at this point add up to close to 300 acres. So a lot of the really great work that that happens in our county is because of connecting directly with a landowner who has a conservation ethic, has connections to their community, and is willing to be that connector to our programming. So as you think about ways that your organization can facilitate more conservation, this is definitely one way. If you are one of those people or know one of those people, I'd be really delighted to talk to them or to you about that more specifically. And we also, unfortunately, have to do some enforcement action if there are instances where people have disobeyed the terms of their easement. Thankfully, this happens very little. All right, a little bit more about our program specifically with the Land Trust. This began in 2018, and since then we've received 3 grants from the LaSarre Sam's Outdoor Heritage Fund, totaling around $9 million at this point. Our latest grant just came on in July here. And like I mentioned just a second ago, we've protected almost 350 acres with these dollars and have almost 250 acres more moving toward completion. And this is just the easements. This doesn't include the acres that we've worked on habitat improvement projects. All right, so moving on to habitat improvement. Our habitat improvement programming extends beyond the boundaries of just the private landowners to the public sector. So we can work with people on conservation easements that do have easements on private lands, but also we can work on public lands that have designated natural areas, and also on natural areas with other entities that are permanently protected. So we've done a variety of projects. The image there on the top is a project that we did with the city of Eden Prairie in the Prairie Bluffs area to remove cedar trees and buckthorn to help restore one of the only remnant native prairies in the county. So this is a really special project, and we've been working on that with them since the very beginning of our grant funding, and are excited to say that it's going really well, and have worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service as well on this project to enhance the seeding of native prairie species out there. The picture on the bottom is a reforestation that we completed with a private landowner to restore maple basswood forest. This project installed about 2,000 trees. We really upped the ante this year and just completed this spring a project that had closer to 20,000 trees. And we're really excited to monitor that project as it goes on. Some of the services that we provide to our partners and individual landowners in our habitat improvement programming is to provide technical advice and assistance. Sometimes that's all people want, sometimes that's all partners want, and we're happy to play that role. We can also work with partners to develop those management plans I mentioned, and also to manage and implement the projects themselves. So we can do the contracting, we can plan the project, we can do the oversight, and really kind of hold the hand of the entity we're working with as much as they would like. Some partners have a lot of technical staff and finance is available, and they like to take a little bit more control of the projects themselves. And so we can kind of balance to see what feels best for each of the partners we work with, and we can kind of be more invested or less kind of involved depending on your needs. We also can help support outreach and events. One of the fun things that we've done in the past is we've done seed collections with volunteer groups to collect native seed across some of the sites we've restored or are enhancing. And the photo on the bottom is what we call Tree Trek. This was originally started by the U of M, and the Hennepin County staff have adopted that to install little signs in the field that have QR codes and some definitions and images to provide the public with a way to interact with some of the projects that have been completed. So we did this with the Boys and Girls Club camp, Voyager on Little Long Lake, and have had some discussions with the city of Brooklyn Park on doing something similar in the prairie that we restored there. So there's lots of ways to implement this. It doesn't have to be trees. It's just a really cool tool to get the public engaged. And then also we can offer you partner support if you're applying to a grant. All right, so kind of on to the thing that I think is the most fun. This is a program that I spearheaded a few years ago, and we've been in our second year of the pilot program as of this year. This programming is helping us to establish a baseline condition for all of our easements, do a species inventory across the county on all the different sites that we manage and hold. And also it helps guide our habitat improvement projects. So we're attempting to do monitoring efforts pre and post implementation of work so that we can actually track quantitatively what the results look like. Did we do a good job? Did this get us where we wanted to go? Or do we need to adapt and try something different next time? It's an excellent way to connect with people. Man, the photos we've gotten are so great. We have cameras out in the field, and just being outside, getting images of people with the species that are out here has been fabulous for social media and for news and other things that we can share. And people love it, and we love it. It's really hard not to be happy about a little skink or a little toad. And also it is really important for us to be part of adding to the network of data that exists in the state. So we are contributing this data to Fish and Wildlife Service and the DNR and other entities that are collecting similar data sets. We're doing this across a large group of taxa. So we're doing vegetation surveys, pollinator surveys, bird surveys, mammal surveys, reptile and amphibian surveys, butterfly surveys, dragonfly surveys, and we're also surveying for bats, which I'm very excited about. All right, so just a few thoughts that I had about how you might protect habitat in the watershed district. I think the first that came to mind to me was just to continue protecting water quality and habitat through your rules, which is very obvious, but felt like I should mention it. The second is to consider habitat improvement projects in the watershed that you either hold or have easements on. And I'll provide this PowerPoint to you all, and this is a link that actually goes to a habitat restoration enhancement intake form. So if you're interested in doing a project with us or working with a partner, can you see this now that I've changed the screen? Okay, so there's a handful of questions in here, and I don't think this should take more than 20 to 30 minutes to complete. There's pretty short limits to words. We're just trying to get an idea, a sense of what the project is. We don't want this to feel too arduous because we're going to follow up with conversations and site visits to see kind of where this would go. But this would be one of the very first steps to take if you're interested in doing a habitat improvement project with the county. And also that if there's a way to work with the city or someone else within your watershed district that has land that maybe you would like to see restored, but you don't own or hold, you can send them to that link as well, or work with them together on their behalf. Another thing that you can do is to encourage landowner participation in our conservation easement programming. I know that a lot of your watershed is fairly urban, but there are still places in the watershed that have open and green space. And there is a way to help us advertise some of this work in that link that's at the very bottom right here, which is our land protection and restoration media kit. This media kit provides all sorts of built-in content around social media posts, website posts, newsletter posts that you can literally copy and paste or edit to kind of the degree that you would like for your own resources that you provide to people within your watershed. So if you have any questions about any of those things, please reach out to me. And then the last thing I wanted to share with you is our natural resource viewer, which again, kind of a teaser because there's a lot in here and I just wanted to share it with you. This is a link to the website. And this is what the, oops. I guess maybe I close that one. There we go. So this is what the map looks like. You can search by address or PID of a property. There's a little image up here that you can turn aerial imagery on or off. One of the cool things about this map is that there's lots of years of aerial imagery. You can go back way back and look at your watershed and see what parts of the watershed looked like kind of early on, which is really great. And I know a lot of places in Hennepin were already experiencing agriculture and development at that time, but it is kind of an interesting way to look kind of at adjacent landscapes to see what might have been historically inhabiting those places. You can also do a compare, which is kind of nice, where you can look at 2 years kind of side to side by switching off and on these buttons. And then one of our newer features is that you can turn on the original land survey, which is then PDFs in. So now you can use it as a background map. So this is basically what was surveyed out here during the original land survey. So take that with a grain of salt. Those things are only so accurate, and there was a bias associated with all of it, really geared towards forestry. And so not everything is as accurate as it might you might want it to be, but it's still a really interesting tool and resource. There's tons of layers in here for things that may or may not be important to project work that you're exploring. You can look at parks, you can look at geology, land cover classification, DNR native plant community locations, MLCCS land cover data, which some of you may be familiar with, is a land cover classification tool that the DNR developed to identify high quality or the quality of habitats, but also the type of habitats. And it's really specific to the metro because the native plant community classifications that are utilized by USGS really weren't a very good fit for here because a lot of the stuff's pretty degraded. I'm a part of a working group that's updating this right now as a side note for later. But there's tons of stuff in here related to kind of land layers, but also water layers. So some of the cool things that we've done recently is to add a couple of different versions of the NWI. So there's a NWI layer that's just the NWI. Then we've also got a categorized version of the NWI, so you can see the different types of wetlands. There's floodplains in here. There's lake grades in here, impaired waters and wetlands. So lots of different things that you can spend time exploring. And if you'd like to have an entire session dedicated to this map and using it and all its tools, because I've barely scratched the surface of what's available here and also some of the outputs that can be found over here once you get really into it, please let me know, and that's something that maybe we can schedule for another day. And I think with that, I should probably open it for questions so I don't get you guys behind for the very first time in your history of meetings.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
We did have a question in the chat.
Oh,
Andrew.
Let me see if I can pull that up here. Can Kristine explain how these services connect with the Hennepin County departments doing the same activities?
Sure. So I am Hennepin County, which I know is a little bit weird. I serve as the Soil and Water Conservation District, but I think about a decade ago, the Soil and Water Conservation District was actually absorbed into the county. We're one of, I think, two in the state that are like this. And we reside in the Public Works Department within Environment and Energy, and then we're called the Land and Water Unit, but essentially we're the Soil and Conservation District. And I like to say, or my colleague actually came up with this, that we're kind of an SWCD plus because we do all the same things as an SWCD, Plus, we get to do a whole bunch of other things as a product of being housed within the county and having funding that is much broader than a traditional SWCD. And this programming is actually one of those things that's a little bit of a, it's not something that a soil and water district wouldn't do, but having a program of this caliber and of this scale is pretty unique for an SWCD. And partly the reason we can do that is because we have the resources of the county behind us.
So that was my question. And if I can follow up a little bit, I'm just wondering, so I'm wondering what departments in Hennepin County are in control of reacting to this information?
Oh, yes. So a lot of them. Everything we do has to go all the way up to the commissioners. I just had a signature page go all the way up to the top just yesterday. So every time we close an easement, every time we get a grant, it has to go all the way through. We're in close coordination also with our appraiser's office, because obviously there's typically questions about that people have. And yeah, I mean, I think those are the two big hitters, but occasionally we've intersected with our transportation department if our easements are in close proximity to like transit projects and things like that.
So if we really like this program and we want to push it, we talk to our commissioners and say, this is great, do more, put more money into it, that kind of thing, right?
I mean, that would be great. I mean, we're not asking for any funding from anybody. We are more just interested in having this publicized and finding connections in your watershed community to work with.
Thanks.
Michelle, do your hand up?
Yeah, so I guess one of my questions is, I think the second thing that you talked about was around, it didn't necessarily have to be easements, that you were working on habitat improvement, but I was curious, when you think about like all the different stakeholders or entities that are in Hennepin County, is like, I live in Eden Prairie, so how would you typically work with, or the watershed district, like how would you work with these other organizations that are maybe have similar goals? So it's like the city of Eden Prairie, they have a project, it might be within the watershed. As far as like ownership or collaboration or the tools that you would sort of use to like work together on something like that?
Sure. Yeah. So the first step really would be to submit that interest form and let us know that you have a project that you think would be a good fit. And then it kind of goes from there. So we would review that project, make sure that it's in line with our grant requirements, that there's, nothing that's going to trip us up, like other covenants or easements or things that might kind of get in the way of a project being implemented. We do obviously have to make sure that it is the right type of property. So it has public ownership or is a privately held conservation easement or has some sort of conservation or natural resource designation on the property that makes it under the state's perspective protected enough for us to invest those funds. So most of the time that's pretty clear. There's been a few occasions where we've kind of had to go back and say, hey, does this qualify? Are we okay? So there's a few like due diligence steps that we have to take. Once we get to the point where we've decided on the project, which there's a lot of kind of intermediary steps that can fall in there. One of which is a site visit, another of which is that we do some internal work to fill out a prioritization worksheet. So we go through and look at what the ecological benefits are, what the water quality benefits are, how it, is this adjacent to other properties? Something that I think is going to be a valuable note for your watershed is it meeting the needs of any of the diversity, equity, and inclusion priorities that the county has. So is this located to areas of diversity? Is this located to low income areas? Those are things that we also take into account and actively would like to work on. We did a project like that in Brooklyn Park to restore a prairie near a more low income area to make sure everyone's got access to the cool stuff we have in the state. We also have a technical evaluation panel that's filled with a handful of folks from other like entities and nonprofits to help us make decisions. So usually that means conversation around how we might approach a project differently than we had planned, or just some ideas and thoughts on how that could be executed. Very rarely have those conversations been a don't do that project. It has occurred occasionally, but mostly that's kind of a due diligence step that we take to make sure that we're making good decisions. Once we're through all of that, when we're working with a partner entity, we'll usually enter into some sort of memorandum of agreement to make sure that we can collaborate effectively. And that will depend a little bit on how much involvement you really need from us. So like I mentioned earlier, some entities really don't need so much handholding and others do. And part of the intake form is trying to understand exactly what that level of input is from the county that is needed. And that also usually involves access agreements to things to make sure everyone is legally okay to be doing what they're doing.
So just a quick follow-up is, so like if a city owns some public land and they felt like they needed some restoration effort, they would sort of be the primary connection. They would reach out to your office, and then there would have to, I guess I'm still like, would they be the owners of the project? Would they be kind of the ones that would be developing the project, or is that why they're coming to you?
It can be either or. So for instance, we've worked with Three Rivers Park District, and they are highly capable, right? They have an entire, like their entire entity basically is doing these types of projects. So they don't need a lot of help from us. So they can go ahead and develop that project, design that project, input that into the form, have some conversations with us, and we can kind of say, cool, like you guys really, this all looks good. You've thought this through. We trust that as a natural resource entity, this all is going to like line up with our goals and missions. And then there are other cities that don't have a big plan laid out yet. You know, they might need us to help develop that management plan, and we can do that with them also. But they do know that they want to, you know, improve this forest. This is an important forest in their community, and they know that much, but they might not know how to execute that, and that's okay. That just is a part of those initial conversations and helping us understand that you've got the goal, and understanding that we need to be part of the process to help understand how to get there. So it's really case dependent. I know that's not super black and white answer, but that's just kind of how it's rolled out so far.
Kristine, another message in or question from the chat was, are the conservation easements for private properties or public properties as well?
Mostly for private properties. It is possible for us to do conservation easements on publicly held land, although it is much more difficult. There are two main trajectories that can happen. The first is if we try to attempt that through our outdoor heritage funding, it requires a lot more review from the Outdoor Heritage Council. And they basically have to decide that the protections on that publicly held land are not sufficient enough, and that a conservation easement would provide significant improved conservation protection. So if there's, you know, typically if there's language in, you know, city code that designates something as a natural area, that would be a pretty hard sell to the council. If it's an area that has been kind of left fallow, but is maybe zoned for commercial development, then we might have more of a discussion to have. It's still a little trickier because it is publicly held land, and the statutes and for the state are not explicit beyond the fact that it's publicly held. And so it is just a little bit more work. The other alternative is that the Minnesota Land Trust will work with entities to do that work on a different track that requires that the entity pays for the process. So our granting covers everything. We do the due diligence work. We pay for the surveys. We pay for the whole process to happen. My time, the land trust time, everything is covered. So there's basically no cost to the landowner or the public entity that might be interested in this. If you take the land trust's approach of just working with them directly, there isn't that kind of due diligence work that has to happen with the Sword Sands Council. So that's kind of out of the picture, but it will cost money to do that work, and it isn't cheap. I don't have the dollar amount in front of me, but I think it's like $100,000 or something around that to pay for all of the things that needs to happen in that process. So there are those two options. Neither of them is super simple.
Thank you. Manager Crafton, you had your hand up?
Try to get unmuted. Yeah, so there've been a lot of slope failures in Hennepin County. I think I heard the number of 600 at one point.
Oh, wow, I didn't even know.
Yeah, and given that we have 3 creeks that flow to the Minnesota and we're trying to stop loading, are there projects or ways to get help from the county on doing slope stability work?
Yeah, that's possible. I think that would probably be through our natural resource grants. So we have 2 grant programs within the umbrella of the natural resource grants. And the one that I think you would want to do is the opportunity grant. That's the one that is bigger dollars, and usually slope projects are really expensive. So the other one I think is just too small a dollar amount. I think it caps out at like 10K. And the opportunity grants you can use for planning as well. So those might be helpful. Depending on where the project is located and what its context is, it's possible the programming that I run might be a good fit. Some of the work we've done in Eden Prairie has done some slope work where there have been drainages. You know, we've been really careful about making sure that habitat improvement work has been a positive impact to existing drainages, but none of the areas have been in terrible shape. So I think based on kind of the water quality focus of that and the likely kind of cost and like goal of that work, I think the natural resource grants would be your best bet.
Okay, thank you.
Look, I think Savannah, you've had your hand up for a minute, so maybe I'll call on you.
Yeah, so this is kind of a run or a follow-up question to the question about conservation easements and like the public versus private land application. So would habitat improvement, like the habitat improvement program, would that be more for public land?
That's for both.
Okay.
So there's the form that I linked in the PowerPoint goes directly to the form that is for entities like the watershed or city, so public or nonprofit partners. There's a separate trajectory that we use for working with private landowners. So if someone were to establish a private conservation easement in your watershed district, we typically we reach out directly to those people because we're very motivated to do work on that land. There's not a lot of funding in other places to do that kind of work. And it's my perspective, and I'm kind of running the program this way, that it's not protected unless you are continuing to enhance and improve it. Because you can't just leave things alone and pretend that it's going to stay really nice, or even if it's not great now, it's just going to get worse, right? Because noxious weeds and other invasive species are a real problem. So we're pretty dedicated to that and typically reach out directly, although folks can, we do have a different form for private landowners that they can use also.
Thank you. Manager DeVal had his hand up as well.
Kristine, you may have mentioned this already, but I'm just wondering, not to put you on the spot, but do you have any examples of any other watersheds in the metro area where you've partnered or done something in conjunction with a watershed?
Yeah, not yet. Our programming is pretty new. So at least in the context of this program, we worked a lot with watershed districts in Western Hennepin for a very long time through our soil and water district work. So we sit as technical advisors on quite a few watershed districts like Pioneer Sarah Creek, for example, and do a lot of very traditional soil and water conservation district projects with those watersheds. So doing things like wascobs or buffers or cover crops or drainage improvements. But in the context of this program, Habitat Conservation Program, since we've only begun in 2018, we're still a little bit getting our feet under us and figuring out what it looks like to work with partners. Mostly we've worked with cities and also the Three Rivers Park District. We have a few easements that are located in Minnehaha Creek Watershed District and have started some planning work to think about what projects we might do with them, which include a large wetland restoration and also some drainage projects. So there is work that we're planning to do and hoping to do, but nothing that we've executed with a watershed partner in the context of this programming, but really eager to do that work and would love to figure out what that looks like.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Comments?
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure,
And maybe you
Michelle.
mentioned this at the very beginning, Kristine, but how are you funded entirely through taxpayer money? Like you're giving out these grants, and is that sort of through, say more about that?
Sure, that's a big question. This program, the Habitat Conservation Program that I mentioned today that establishes easements and does habitat improvement work, is funded exclusively through the Lessard-Sam's Outdoor Heritage Fund. My staff time is partially supported, and some of the other staff I work with is partially supported by the county. But all of the work that is implemented is paid for through that grant. And that grant we hold in partnership with the Minnesota Land Trust, so that $9.1-ish million in total is split between the two entities. So we receive the funding associated with habitat improvement projects, and the Land Trust receives the money that's associated with easement establishment, and we collaborate across those two different work areas to get that accomplished. The rest of our unit is funded in a handful of different ways, and I don't know every single one of them, but I'm happy to follow up with you. Most of it is through the Hennepin County Enterprise Fund, which is associated with the TAC, the trash incinerator that generates energy in North Minneapolis, which I know seems a little ironic because I'm talking about habitat and natural resources, and that's the thing that we get our money from, but that's where it comes from. And that's the majority of our funding. We get a very small percentage, and this is a very new thing from the tax base. And we also get funding from the state of Minnesota and through some direct contracts with watershed districts where we play that technical advisory role. So it's coming from a handful of different pockets. And if you would like more details on those different pockets, I'd be happy to follow up, but that's kind of the general overview.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Okay, any other questions? Wonderful. Kristine, thank you so much for being here. Again, how can we get in touch with you if we need to get in touch with you other than through the website?
Yep, my email is up here on the screen. That's probably the best place to connect with me. And I did also want to mention, I forgot to in my presentation, we have a handful of resources about our programming and other things related to both easements, habitat improvements, and a handful of pamphlets we created about bird and bat conservation. If that's something the watershed district would be interested in, I'd be happy to mail those to your office as well. And we have a lot of resources online too, so I can follow up with a few links to our website that might be of help.
Great, thanks.
That'd be great. Thank you, Kristine.
Sure thing. Good to meet you all.
Wonderful.
Good
Thank you so
evening.
much for being here, Kristine.
Yep.
Thank you.
Louise and I would like to say
Very
thanks.
interesting.
also.
Thank you.
Great job.